Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I am your host, Lacey Bean, and today we are going to be talking about a man that is bottom of the barrel disgusting. So today we're going to be talking about Frank Houston. If you don't know who Frank Houston is, he is the father of Brian Houston. Brian Houston is the founder of the Hillsong Church. Hillsong was founded in Sydney, Australia, and it has locations all across Australia and in America, I'm pretty sure. I think that's the only two countries they're in. But Frank Houston is Brian Houston's father. Frank Houston's name is actually William Francis Houston, but he went by Frank. He was born April 22nd of 1922, and he was a very prominent evangelical leader. He was a Pentecostal leader, specifically within the Assemblies of God. But originally, he was actually first trained within the Salvation Army. He was actually a lieutenant there. He then transferred to the Baptist denomination, and then he went on to the Assemblies of God, where he was a very prominent leader and people loved him. They adored him. He was just a man of God that everyone just looked up to. But unfortunately, by the mid 1990s, many cases of abuse came forward accusing Frank Houston of pedophilia. A lot of these allegations were brought to the attention of Pastor Don Barry, who was in New Zealand. He was part of the Assemblies of God congregation in New Zealand. As these allegations were coming forward, he said it was as if the dominoes just kept falling. He got the first allegation, and then he got another, and then he got another, and he investigated each and every one of them and found them to be credible. But even though these allegations were credible, he spoke with the victims and none of them wanted to go to the police. I think the main reason that a lot of these people didn't want to go to the police were they didn't think that they would be believed because Frank Houston did have such a strong representation and people just adored him. So I think there was this fear that it's like, who are they going to believe? Me, Joe Schmo, or Frank Houston, who is very well known in this, Christian denomination. Pastor Barry ended up passing these allegations along to the leaders within the New Zealand Assemblies of God. And then in 2000, the New Zealand Assemblies of God leaders let the Australian Assembly of God leaders know that these rumors and allegations had been brought forth against Frank Houston. Now, by this point, Frank Houston had already left New Zealand and had been ministering within Australia for a while at this point. So that's why it went from New Zealand to Australia. The sad thing is that Pastor Don Barry said that he knew that the cases that he knew of were just the tip of the iceberg. He knew that these cases were credible. He knew that these victims had been abused and that if there were these few coming forward, there had to be more, considering how old Frank Houston was and how old these victims were at the time of the abuse and how old they were now and how much time had passed. Like, he knew, no, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, one of Frank's victims, his name is Brett Sangstock. Now, Brett used to be known as AHA. That was his pseudonym in the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission is a investigation department within, I think it's in New Zealand and Australia, but specifically this one was in Australia, and they look into the abuse of children and how industries, churches, things like that, handle these cases of abuse. And so he gave his story to the commission in, I think it was 2014. But as this case and the more victims of Frank have come forward, Brett decided about 3 years ago to actually give up his anonymity and let his name and face be known as one of Frank's victims. Now, Brett was a victim of Frank when he was a young boy between the ages of 8 and 12. Frank was living in New Zealand and he would come to Australia and be like a visiting pastor at their church. And this boy, Brett, at the time, his family was very close to Frank and they were family friends. And so when he would come into town to preach, he would actually stay at this family's home. And then in the middle of the night, when everybody was asleep, Frank would creep into Brett's room and abuse him. Frank would tell him things like, "You're my golden boy, you're my chosen one." Just, super gross pedophilia shit. Now, Brett has said that when this abuse was happening, he was frozen in fear. He was petrified. He said he couldn't breathe. He didn't know what to do. He was so young. But then when Brett became 12 years of age and started hitting puberty, Frank started to lose interest in him because he just wasn't young enough. Ugh, I don't even want to like saying that. It's just so freaking gross. But he lost interest in him and the abuse stopped. But Brett was still terrified and ashamed of everything that had happened. He stayed quiet for many years. When he was 16, he went to his mom and he finally told his mom about the abuse. And his mom's response was so devastating. His mom's response was, "Well, you don't want to be sending people to hell and not sending them to the church." Basically saying, like, if you out Frank, it's going to give the church a bad name and people aren't going to get saved. So you're basically sending them to hell by you bringing forth this accusation of abuse. I can't imagine what that would be like hearing at 16 years old and not being able to like really understand how abusive just that statement is. And Brett didn't know what to do, so once again, he stayed quiet. Now, 20 years later, Brett's mom actually went to the leaders of the Assemblies of God in Australia and told them about the abuse that her son, Brett, had endured by the hands of Frank. And Brett had no knowledge that his mom was going to do this, but she did, and things started to blow up. Now, I'm not exactly sure the exact timeline of when the mom went to the leaders within the Assemblies of God, but it is known that by 1999, Brian Houston, who was a very prominent leader, I think he was like president of the Assemblies of God branch or something. He was high up there with the Assemblies of God within Australia at this time. And by 1999, it is well known that he did find out about the abuse that his father did to these victims and about his pedophilia. And it is stated that this is how the church handled the accusations as they came forward. So as Brett's accusation came forward, they did an investigation. They confronted Frank, and Frank actually confessed to it, which shocking. Like, most leaders and most abusers don't confess. So it is very shocking that Frank did this, but he did confess, and they took Frank out of leadership automatically, but they let him retire, like forced him to retire, but with a pension, and said that he wasn't allowed to preach anymore, which from what I can gather, he didn't preach after this, and they disallowed him to have any access to children. But from what I gathered, that he still had access to children even after this, allegedly. I have to say that, allegedly. Brett says that during this time that everybody knew about his abuse, they actually downplayed it, his experience. And even though they knew the abuse was wrong, even though they knew that this was criminal activity, he still said that he felt like his experience was downplayed and that he actually wasn't given any kind of help. There was no apology. There was no justice. And he said none of them even offered any kind of help, like counseling. Like, can you imagine being a leader and knowing like this abuse happened, this is criminal, and you're not even offering any kind of help, like counseling, anything to the victims? Like, God, it's such a slap in the face. Now, Frank did settle with Brett and paid him $12,000 for his forgiveness. But from what I've been able to deduce from these interviews and articles is that Frank actually never technically apologized. It was kind of like, yeah, I did this, but you need to forgive me. Like, what the fuck? Now, a pastor named Bob Cotton did not know the extent of the abuse or that there was even pedophilia that was happening by the hands of Frank until 2014 when he heard the story of Brett Singstock's abuse. And he was baffled and blown away. Like, how could this happen and us not be told about it? So this is when Bob Cotton ended up deciding, I'm doing an investigation. Bob Cotton was a pastor within the Assemblies of God, denomination. And so he started going to work and this is what he was able to put together with a timeline. In December of 1999, Brian Houston, Frank Houston's son, ended up calling a crisis meeting to go over the Brett's abuse allegation. And they ended up saying in this meeting, they kept the minutes secret of this meeting, but they ended up saying that it was a single act of abuse that happened 30 years ago. Like, quote, that what? Even if it was just one, like, oh, it was just one, we can move on. Like, no need to dwell on this. God. Then in November of 2000, they found even more allegations totaling 6, because also, if you remember, in 2000 is when the New Zealand Assemblies of God told the Australian Assemblies of God about all the abuse allegations that had come forward in New Zealand towards Frank Houston. So now they're like, oh shit, no, it's not one. Nope, definitely not. Through the investigation of Frank and his abuse, they have found out that it has dated back 50 plus years. It has dated back all the way to when Frank Houston was a lieutenant in the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army has confirmed that in 2003, they received an allegation from a boy who said that Frank Houston abused him when Frank actually worked at one of the boys' home within the Salvation Army. There was another man that came forward. He was anonymous for a while, but he gave up also his anonymity to tell his story, and his name is David Cowdery. Frank Houston would come to David's family home for evening prayers and things like that, and then Frank would excuse himself to go to the bathroom, but actually sneak into David's room at night while David was sleeping and abuse him. And then the church made a statement about Frank in December of 2000, saying that they would not be going public about the allegations and that they would only go public, quote, if the rumors became so extensive. And then in December of 2001, the Assemblies of God within Australia have known about this abuse for 2 years at this point, minimum. They sent out a statement to all of the congregations within the Assemblies of God, letting them know that Frank has stepped down from his position of leadership because of a, quote, serious moral failure. What? A serious moral failure is cheating on your wife, not committing a fucking crime of pedophilia. Drastic difference there. Fucking drastic. They even said in this letter, quote, we cannot see any reason for this to be announced to your church or further afield. No reason? I can count as many children that are in your congregation as reasons for this to be talked about. Now, as all of this has come forward over the last 21 years, the Royal Commission in Australia has done an investigation into how the church has handled this. Specifically, they are right now investigating Brian Houston. Remember, Brian is the leader and founder of Hillsong, but he was not in Hillsong the time that he knew about his father's abuse. So Brian found out in 1999. He was a leader within the Assemblies of God, but Brian himself and none of the other leaders went to authorities about what his father had done. Now, Brian, because of his leadership within the Assemblies of God, he actually handled a lot of this and how his father was treated. A lot of people have come back saying, well, that is a huge conflict of interest. Not only are you like the leader of this church, like congregation, denomination, or whatever, but he's also your freaking father. So like somebody else should have taken up this investigation and handled how this all went down. Now, Brian says that he took this information. He asked Brett if he wanted to go forward to police, but Brett said no. And so Brian said he believed that it was up to Brett to go to the police at this point, since the time they found out about this, Brett was an adult. So that was his reasoning and other leaders' reasoning for not going to authorities. He said he did, and other leaders did tell the top leadership within Assemblies of God as like an entire denomination, and then they handled it from there. And Brian's, in a roundabout way of saying like, well, my hands were off of it after that. So this is This is where I have a problem. Brian made a statement in 2014. It's linked below. He made it through the Hillsong Church. Now, this has nothing to do with the Hillsong Church, except that Brian is the founder of it, and it was his father who committed this abuse. But this specifically has nothing to do with Hillsong that I could find in any of my research. But Brian made a statement in 2014, and part of his statement reads, quote, "We fully support the commission. As we've seen over many years, parts of the Christian church have failed our children by turning a blind eye to abuse and even covering it up." But then if you go back in time and find and see those documents that they have hidden, basically, when they first found out about the abuse, okay, yeah, your father was taken out of leadership and he wasn't allowed to minister anymore, but he was allowed to retire on a pension, and nobody was told about the abuse for years. What the fuck? That is covering it up. Like, what? Okay. Brian also goes on in his statement to read, quote, "There was no delay in action. From the moment we knew and he confessed, his ministry stopped. We referred the matter to the National Executive of the Assembly of God. The investigation and subsequent actions were then handled by the AOG, Assemblies of God, without my interference." Now, there is a clause in the law stating that within Australia, that you can have basically like a justifiable reason to not go to authorities when an abuse scenario like this, like child abuse, happens. But that's a really big gray area of like, okay, but what justifies a justifiable excuse? Brian is saying that yes, he feels like it was a justifiable reasoning to not go to authorities because Brett was an adult at the time, and so he could go to authorities on his own. I don't know. I don't know how this is going to work out. He is being investigated right now. Just recently, Brian did step down from leadership within the Hillsong Church so that he can handle these allegations from the Royal Commission and that he can handle this investigation. He is cooperating, but he is pleading not guilty with this investigation and trial. So I don't know what's going to happen. I do know that the law has changed within Australia. If you are found guilty of hiding abuse, like sexual abuse to minors, then you can face up to 7 years in prison, which has increased because the minimum used to be 2. Now I think the minimum is 7, which has increased in the last couple of years. So it's some pretty serious charges he could face. So I don't know. Comment below. What is your opinion? Do you think that Brian has a case to not be found guilty? I don't know. I think he should have said something. There were too many victims. And the fact that his father did not have any kind of consequences to what he did is disgusting. I just can't imagine, like, if that was my father and knowing there were so many victims and that he was a pedophile. I can't imagine not going to police, because as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, I would hands down be turning them in and standing with the victims. So it is disheartening that Brian and many of the other leaders did not do that. But I also think that if Brian is going to be investigated, then all of the other leaders need to also be investigated and held to the exact same standard, because I don't think it was just Brian. From what I have gathered in my research, that there are many other leaders that are still there today, that were top leaders in the early 2000s, that are still top leaders today within the Assemblies of God, which is now known as Australian Christian churches or something like that. But they're still the same leaders, so they definitely need to be held accountable too. I'll keep you guys updated as this case progresses, and we'll see what happens. But comment below your opinion. I'd love to hear it, and we'll see where this goes. But definitely, more leaders in churches need to be held accountable for hiding abuse, causing abuse, and just, oh God, the rampant pedophilia within church leaders is just fucking disgusting. Once again, this is another heavy case, so go take care of yourselves. Go do some self-care activities. Go take a walk, drink some water, binge some Netflix, but most importantly, have a good day. I love you all. I will see you again next week. I'll be covering a cult. So exciting. They're so fascinating. I know. So fascinating. So creepy. But anyways, I'll stop talking now. Thank you for joining in on this video. I will see you guys next week. Bye.